Thank you very much for having me today. And I'm going to be talking about how we can use marine restoration, habitat restoration, as a way of achieving marine net gain in the UK. And that comes from experience over the last decade of working in the field of marine restoration, myself in Wales, England, and now more recently Scotland. Marine habitats fundamentally support biodiversity. If you create a habitat, generally it has a three-dimensional structure, and with that three-dimensional structure creates a habitat for animals and plants to live in, and there are consequential cascades of biodiversity that follow on from that. So there is a lot of evidence that suggests that seagrasses, kelp, salt marsh have higher biodiversity than other areas, unvegetated, unstructured areas of the seabed. And there's a lot of work globally that shows how when you get that three-dimensional structure, that's underpinning biodiversity. So measures that can bring back that three-dimensional structure are critical for enhancing biodiversity. But the problem is that, as we all know, our three-dimensionally structured habitats have declined in coverage. In the UK, we've lost huge amounts of salt marsh, we've lost huge amounts of oyster reefs, we've lost huge amounts of seagrass, merle beds are almost non-existent, and we're actually in a situation where, if we're looking at marine gain and marine net gain, there are huge opportunities for restoration as a way of enhancing our marine biodiversity. And it's not just a case of thinking about the negative. We're at ground zero here, guys. We can bring a lot of biodiversity back. So it's a huge opportunity. But marine habitat restoration isn't easy. But what we're discovering from our work all around the UK, from South Wales in Pembrokeshire to Gwynedd in North Wales, Isle of Wight, to the Firth of Forth, is that it can actually be effective. When we use a science-based, evidence-based approach to seagrass restoration, it can be highly successful. And we're now seeing plants all around our sites. 8 of our 10 sites that have been planted over the last 18 months have got established populations of seagrass present in them. They're a long way from being meadows, but they're effective habitats that are now supporting animals in them at a very small level, creating the opportunity for a much larger restoration to actually happen. What we know from other parts of the world is that you don't just plant a seagrass meadow, or you don't just plant an oyster reef. It takes a long period of time to develop these things. To any projects that sit under the marine net gain concept, need to consider that long-term view of restoration. Of if you're going to actually recover these habitats, then you need decades to do it. In Chesapeake Bay in the US, they've restored over 3,000 hectares of seagrass, but that took 30 years. And it wasn't that they planted one lot of seeds in one place in one moment of time. They went back. They considered the ecology of the sites. They considered the environment of the sites. And with it, they were able to bring back biodiversity and ecosystem services into that space. Finally, though, I want to think more broadly about what we've learned from other terrestrial biodiversity offsetting and net gain type examples, where we know that just because you create a project that says it's going to restore or recover or mitigate from an impact, doesn't mean that's actually going to happen. And we need evidence at the heart of that. And down the road from me in South Wales, there's a hot potato that always arrives in the media at some point. It's been dragged through the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, about a mouse bridge that cost a couple of £100,000. failed and never has had any evidence around it. And that's what we need to think about, is that it has to be evidence-based, it has to be long-term view, but it can be effective if science is underpinning that strategy in the long term. And that's it for me, and I'll pass you on to our next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.